I have the honor of introducing our CTO, Stefan, who will be sharing a presentation on the key considerations for deciding when to refactor versus rewrite. Stefan has more than 27 years of experience in the IT industry, working as a software engineer, consultant, and CTO. Over the past 14 years, he has helped numerous clients determine the best application modernization strategy for their business. He also has extensive experience overseeing Covalience's development teams as they maintain, update, and rewrite client applications. He has worked in India over the past 19 years and enjoys competing in marathons and ultramarathons in his spare time. Following Stefan's presentation, he will be joined by Paul Weirott of Alliance Franchise Brands and Trevor Bunch of The Signatory for a panel discussion on their experiences navigating application refactors and rewrites. So without further ado, Stefan, I will hand it over to you.
Thank you so much, Tracy, and yeah, thank you for that introduction. One correction, I've been in India for 20 years altogether, but I've been here for the last 14 years. So I want to start with LEHMAN'S laws. For you, some of you have been in the industry a number of years. You might be familiar with these laws of software evolution. The first law says, and that this was actually started in 1972 approximately, and throughout the rest of the last century, and then into 2000 until 2010 about it was completed. First one is continuing change. A system must be continually adapted or it becomes progressively less satisfactory. So you can't just create a system and let it sit there and use it and then expect that it will continue to give you good service. That's the first law. And the second law says the law of increasing complexity. As a system evolves, its complexity increases unless work is done to maintain or reduce it. And so most of you are familiar with this principle. I see it function in my house almost every day. When after I cleaned up and I go away to work and then I come back, sometimes I see that, there's chaos that came about and you have to do it all over again. And so if you actually keep on working on a system, then the next problem is that your software becomes more and more complex. And in the end, you get chaos over time. So if you look at this picture, it is sometimes what our systems look like. It's a little bit here, a little bit there, as your business requirements changes or you add more things into the system, and it results in something which is very hard to maintain and even hard to find the code for something. And what we're actually looking for is a system that looks more like this. It's well organized, you know exactly where everything is. That's the ideal for what we want to have. But over time, things do regress into something a little bit more chaotic. That tends to happen. So this is the main reason why we need to keep on modernizing our apps. There is diminishing value of our software over time, as we said in LEHMAN'S laws. Then you have evolving business requirements. Things keep on changing. New technologies come about. That's not necessarily a reason why we want to change, but sometimes it creates opportunities that you may want to make use of, or maybe you'll fall behind if your competitors are using new technologies. Then you also have certain legacy barriers that need to be overcome. The certain type of tech stack can do only so much. It is not able to do certain things, and then the availability of required development resources become a problem with older technologies. The user friendliness can go down especially as your system may get more users, more data. Then you may have a problem with performance, as well as the user interface. Maybe if you don't keep it up to date, there may be inconsistencies in it. And obviously, I've already mentioned stability and performance. Your system may fall over. There may be other kinds of problems. It's a reason why you need to continuously update your app. But eventually, all software dies. On average, small to mid-sized systems last about 6 to 8 years. That's my experience also, that systems don't last forever. But you can obviously try to make its life as long as possible, and this is what we all try to do. But you know, whether you need to refactor or rewrite, those are the two options that are there before us. And so the question is, and that's a hard question to answer, because it's not very clear and straightforward. Is when do you refactor and when do you rewrite? When do you rebuild the whole thing? Just to get our definitions clear, refactoring is to change the structure of your current app without changing its behavior. So you will maybe restructure it some, but it does exactly the things that it used to do, and it's, you know, it just makes it easier to maintain afterwards. It makes the code more readable. Maybe you can look at adding some documentation so that the developers can more easily understand it. If you want to rewrite, however, that is starting from scratch, and you recreate your existing app. And this could obviously include adding, removing, or changing some of the behaviors of your app. So let's look at some of the deciding factors as to when you want to do which one of these, each one of these. So there are code maintainability, age of the technology, and then code scalability are the three things we are going to look at. There are other things. These are the ones that we've chosen. Let's talk about code maintainability. So, and this is something that we very often bump into, is that especially if we take over a system from another development company, for instance, we realize that there's a lot of technical debt, which means it's very hard to understand what the code is doing. Technical debt results in when you take shortcuts. So that's very often that you have a requirement that you have to build very quickly because the users are waiting for it. And then you take some shortcuts, you don't do the documentation properly, maybe you don't consider splitting it into the proper modules. The code is not structured according to the pattern that you've already followed, and it lacks in. Then it becomes much more difficult to maintain that code. So it lacks documentation. There are sometimes poor coding practices in it. There are maybe long code blocks. The modules are tightly coupled, or they are not separated into modules even. Sometimes the structures that you have in your text also don't allow you to do the things that you want to do. So you kind of have to take make some other arrangements, make some other ways to do it, build an integration and things, which is not always the optimal way of building that into your system. And then the one rule that we found is that if the amount of changes that you have to make, especially if you have a lot of technical debt, which means it makes it very hard to change your code. If it is more than your current code volume, that's when you absolutely have to rebuild your system, because it's going to definitely take you longer to add the extra functionality into your app. Into your existing app. It will be probably easier to rewrite your app and add the existing functionalities. So for code maintainability, I think that is the rule of thumb. It's also when your structures are really rigid and it's hard to change things. When you cannot update your system anymore to do some of the things that you want to do. Age of technology. So the age is very relative. You know, there are very old technologies out there that we are still using, but it's about whether the technology is still supported, actively being updated. If there are still security updates, not just security, but also new functionality being delivered into that tech stack. If it's not, then this is an indication that you may have to move away from that. There is availability of developers. If you can't find the developers for that tech stack anymore, it becomes really hard to keep on working in it. The viability of the underlying technologies. Very often, if the tech stack is built on a certain type of technology, or you have relied in your application on a certain application or a third-party provider, and that becomes not viable anymore. Like, for instance, the licensing changes, that it becomes too expensive, or they change the code so much that it doesn't do what you want it to do anymore, or it just goes away. It dies on you. I'm thinking about a few years ago when Silverlight went away in the .NET stack. It was touted as the big thing for multimedia on the front end for the web, and it lasted about 6 years, 6-7 years, before they said no, we're going to withdraw this from the market. It's still running in certain places, but it's now diminished in capacity and capabilities, and also it's not supported on any of the browsers anymore. So if something like that happens, and we actually have a story very recently, we had an app that used a third-party chat provider, and that chat provider just said, sorry, we're not gonna make this work for you anymore. We are going to utilize this for a different customer base. You have to move away. And they told us like a month in advance. We didn't get the email since the email maybe wasn't sent properly, and so we had to rebuild that system on a new technology in about 2 weeks' time, which took a lot of long nights for us. So yeah, the technology can quickly change things. Security and privacy considerations are there. Nowadays the governments are all announcing more privacy considerations. If your system is not geared to be able to do that, then you have to do a lot of code, and especially if your technical debt is more, and it's hard to build it into that. If the security encryption patterns and any other security isn't correctly configured in your underlying technologies, then that can become a problem as well. And then yeah, so the compatibility of any of your technical components can also diminish over time. So you find suddenly you're not compatible with something anymore because now you need to be on a newer version of the app. If you didn't upgrade it, then that becomes a problem. So as for age of technology, when to rewrite, I would say when any of these factors causes an end-of-life risk to your system, then you really need to consider rewriting, hopefully before that. If you can become aware of this before it's end of life, that's better. All right, let's go to the next factor, code scalability. As you know, our systems keep on growing. We have more users. We have hopefully more users. We have more data in our systems, and if the number of concurrent users becomes so much and that it slows down your system, then you would have to do something. You can put it on the cloud, for instance, and enable automatic scaling there. It depends on the cost and if you can still afford it. Some of these things, if the data becomes too much and it becomes slow, and maybe you're still using MySQL, for instance, MySQL has some limitations on the amount of data that can easily handle. Then you're starting to get problems with code scalability. Maybe your code is not web enabled. Maybe there are any other technical limitations. We've had the number of sessions that you can create with the database and stuff like that. Then that can become an indication that you need to rewrite your system. So if you cannot mitigate, and this is the rule that we follow, if you cannot mitigate any of those performance issues, overcome it by whatever way, separating your data into multiple databases, whatever else, then you may have to consider rewriting. Okay, so business considerations are also there. Even though I usually look at these things from a technical point of view, obviously you need to take a look at your budget and your timeline. You need to look at your goals. You need to look at what your competitors can do. Because if they can do something very nice and you cannot, then that might be a problem for you. Your expected growth, your skill and resource availability is very important to look at, and your return on investment. If you invest this amount of money to rewrite your system, how quickly will it take you to actually get that that as income back, or will you save the money in other ways? And sometimes this is hard to quantify, but if it takes a long time for the developer to find the place where an error occurs in your code, for instance, and then it takes a long time to fix it, then that's something that you may want to consider as a cost, and if with a new tech stack, maybe that will go faster. Okay, let's look at the next slide. These are the pros and cons for refactoring. I already mentioned some of them. You can look it up on your own. I suppose The cost for a refactor is less expensive, at least in the short term. If it's viable, you can actually rebuild your entire system over time, step by step. Sometimes it's not viable. The technologies don't play together nicely. You can leverage your existing development team, which is a pro. You don't have to go and find a new development team. Yeah, you can extend the life of your system that way. And I would say that's very important, that one, keep on refactoring your system, and that really extends the life of your system. Faster market feedback, so that, because immediately your market will see if you publish something new. The cons, it's more complex. In fact, it can be quite a lot more complex to do the refactoring. You cannot change poor or old architecture. If the backbone is in a certain way, then it's very hard to change that. It might be more expensive to rewrite the whole thing later on, especially if you added a lot of functionality. Then your rewrite becomes more expensive later on, and then you're also missing out on some of the new functionalities. Let's go on to the next one. So the pros for a rewrite is that it gives you a fresh start, and you have you can update your tech stack to something that is new. You can find your developers quite easily. You can correct those architectural problems, and in the long term, it usually will save you money. The cons is it's more expensive on the short term, and you may require a new development team while also keeping your old development team to keep your legacy system running. And then the coordination between the legacy system and your rewrite team is very important, because as you add functionality into your legacy, because those users keep on asking for new requirements, you have to also build that into your new system. So, and to make sure that you keep the two systems in sync that way as well. All right, so some of the approaches, those are the 3 factors that can help you make that decision, plus some of the business requirements. Some of the best approaches for refactoring, there are so many different approaches, just a few things that we found to work well. You have to identify the low-hanging fruit first. What's the highest risk for your system? Identify that and try to swap that out, try to replace that with something else, and correct that first. And then the 20-80 rule, the 20% of effort that can change the 80% of the problem for you. That's also very important. It usually makes sense to slow down your new development while you're doing this, but it depends obviously on your budget. It depends on your tech team. Then you can update your underlying technologies and frameworks, which is usually the first thing to do, is to make sure that you're on newest releases of your tech stack and any other underlying technologies. That if you were far behind, and it's like you were in version 2.5 and there's already a version 7.6 out or something like that, then it might become more complex to do that. And that may be a reason why you might have to rewrite your system. So it's good to keep that up to date. And then a good approach is that it helps to have new eyes on the code, not your current developers, because they might not be able to see those problems in the code because they've been working with it so much. But sometimes you get someone who's been talking about it and say, listen, we really need to refactor this thing, and then that's the way to go. All right, so let's look at the best approaches for rewriting. I've got a few considerations here. The tech stack and the architecture need to be considered, and any third-party software that you have in place. My feeling is that if you can write a part of your system and you don't have to use a third-party software, it's usually best. It lengthens the life of your system, because it's often those third-party underlying technologies that that reaches the end of life before your system is ready to do that, and so then you have to rewrite. So try to minimize the third-party software that you include. But I know it's a good strategy sometimes if you have to put something together quickly to pull in a trusted partner application. Approaches, I mean, obviously rebuild and replace. So side by side, you run the two systems, and then you can parallel test them, make sure that they work properly, and then you replace it. You can have an incremental rewrite, sometimes not possible, as I already said. And just important that you must remember that you have to rewrite and maintain. So it is quite an expensive thing sometimes if you do the rewrite, because your maintenance also has to keep on happening. But if you can promise your users there's a new system on the way, just be patient with us. Maybe you can slow down your development on your legacy system. All right. Just one success story. We recently actually helped a customer that came with us with a core PHP e-commerce wholesale plant starter company. It was all written in just like kind of spaghetti code, old code, and all entangled in a way, and it was hard to disentangle it. But that is what we did is we tried to separate it into the presentation and the data layers and the business layer. We refactored, redesigned the checkout process, because that was one of the biggest problems, is that their cart system was wasn't very optimized, and sometimes the cart was abandoned. And then we also took upon us to rewrite their admin part of the system. And so that we did in Laravel framework. They wanted to keep to PHP. They wanted to reuse some of the code, and we said, yes, let's reuse what we can. And so we could reuse some of the code, but we put it on a newer framework, Laravel, which is much faster to develop. It's an MVC framework, and it's much easier to maintain. And obviously we use the best practices to keep all the documentation in place. And currently they seem to be quite happy with that. The other thing that we did is we removed the need for PCI compliance, which is security, because they weren't saving the car details on their system anymore. So that's one of the things that we've done recently. I want to talk a little bit about how we as Covalience can help you. I don't want to talk about that extensively, just a little bit. We have some consultation services. You can read through that. The one that we've recently done for some of our clients is to do a full code review and an architecture review to make sure that their code is still good to carry on. And we actually identified a certain part of the system that could be kept because the technology was still relatively recent, but the front end was in AngularJS, which is end of life, and they have to recreate the front end part of this. So code reviews we can do, and we do project planning and scoping and readiness assessments as well. We also deliver software development services. We deliver teams made up of usually a project coordinator. We have various types of developers for all of the technologies that you can see icons for here. We have design, UI, UX design. We have QA services. We actually have a very big and experienced QA team currently. And we have infrastructure management that we can also deliver to you. And that is the end of my presentation. I think it's time for the panel discussion. I'm going to hand it over to Tracy for now.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Stefan, for your insightful presentation. That was great. So we're now going to transition to the panel discussion. And before we do, we wanted to hear from all of you. So we have another poll for you. You should see it pop up on your screen if you're in the webinar room, or you will see it in the chat if you're joining us on LinkedIn. So we would love to know what you believe is the most important consideration when deciding between refactoring or rewriting an app. Could be either based something maybe in Stefan's presentation, something from your own experience. We just would love to hear your thoughts. So yes, and as a reminder too, if you have any questions you would like us to answer on this webinar live, you can submit them at any time with the Q&A feature in the webinar room or in the chat on LinkedIn, and we'll answer them following the panel discussion. So now I would like to invite Paul and Trevor to come on stage with me. Great. Hi, Trevor. Hi, Paul. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes. So we will go ahead and if you don't mind introducing yourself, maybe Paul, you can go ahead and start us off, share a little bit about yourself and your company.
Sure. Paul Wyrett. I'm the Vice President of Technology Support for Alliance Franchise Brands. We have over 550 locations in North America, and our locations are print and signage providers for the general public, anywhere from standard asks to complex high-end design. And I work as part of a 20-member technology team at the corporate office. We have 2 locations, one in Michigan and one in Maryland, and it's a great team and a great company. And thanks to Covalience for asking me and allowing me to participate.
And I'm
Great. Thank you so much, Paul.
Yeah. Sorry, I'm Trevor. I'm the CIO at the Signatory. We're a global Christian foundation. Our primary service line is operating donor advised funds. So we help families coordinate their generosity across multiple generations and put that in a plan. And currently have, I think, 2,500 donor advised funds. And we contribute out to, donate out to, grant out to, I think, 5,000 charities a year in terms of volume. I think we donated almost $500 million last year in terms of scope. So great ministry. We're happy to bring families and charities together and getting stuff done.
Great. Thank you so much, Trevor and Paul. And Stefan, I'll go ahead and invite you back on stage. He will be moderating the panel discussion, so I'll hand it back to you.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Tracy, and then thanks, Trevor and Paul, for joining us. It's really nice to have you. And so I've got a few questions for you. Maybe Paul, if you can just tell us about a system that you refactored or rewrote during your career so far, and also how did you decide which approach you should follow?
Sure. Personally, I had a practice project, but the first big project in my career was exactly as you suggested. We've been in business for multiple decades, and as a franchisor, our royalty billing system is incredibly important, as you could imagine. And our prior system was 15 or more years old, and I think we had reached the limitations of what we could do. Number one, it wasn't purpose-built, and it was leveraging some of the technology layers available in our main accounting package, and we just ran out of options to add modern business rules as our organization grew. So from the beginning, the direction from our leadership team was a rebuild, and how would that work? So it was a learning experience. Of full disclosure, we did work with Covalience on that project, but that project taught us not only what to do when it comes to deciding rebuild versus refactor, but how to do it and how not to do it. It was an excellent experience, and it's paid dividends down the line. Helped us do some follow-up projects with other systems that we built, brand new as well. And I think that the other aspect I would say is important to note is that as we considered the rebuild, we had to consider the integrations required, which were very important, involving third parties, and also how we were going to put the teams together, both the core team on our side to help define requirements and do QA on our side, but also our technology partner to do the core development and coordinate with the other third parties, a very critical component. As I've worked on many projects with the team, I find that you should really assess your timeline expectations in context with how many people and or systems will be ultimately involved. The more consultants, third-party systems involved, the more time it's going to take, especially if 3 or 4 party talks are involved. Here's the core goal that we want. Everybody has a piece to play. We need to reach consensus on the best approach, and then have everybody stick with that. So
it sounds like you really had a good experience, at least with that. But some good advice there. Thanks. And Trevor, do you have maybe something that you can talk about? Something that you had to rewrite? Or?
Sure. I mean, luckily, I've been doing mostly new product development, but in the last year, it's been a lot of refactoring, and a lot of the things that you were bringing up, Stefan, of you have the airplane built, you're operating it, it's flying, and then some things aren't going so well, and you don't have time to take back and start rebuilding and starting from scratch because you're already in the air. So we had some very when giving season hit last year, and you start seeing increased volumes, more data, and then all those little gremlins that you kind of ignore during the testing phase because that's just a one-off kind of issue started really cropping up. And it's symptomatic in simple things like email notifications, But when you start digging in, you find out, yeah, there's some poor architecture here, some poor coding practices. And that's honestly like when we called you and like, we're about ready to refactor parts of our application because we got to get this done quickly. The time's like ticking, there's business pressure, customer pressure. And those were the drivers, and you had them right on your slide. When time's an issue, you can't step back. Sometimes refactoring is the quickest way of solving the problem.
Yeah, that's a very good illustration. The plane is flying. You can't go back and rebuild it now. You have to rebuild it while flying, right?
Yeah. It's not a position anyone wants to be in, but sometimes you find yourself there, right?
Yeah, that is true. So that comes to that's actually a good cautionary tale, I suppose, for what you're looking at. But maybe do you have any others like that? Any other caution that you need to, some rewrite or refactor gone bad? You can talk about.
Luckily, like, no, I mean, we've had plenty of stuff go wrong, but like, I think when I think about cautionary tales of like specifically what Paul was mentioning is you're bringing in partners, you're increasing the organizational complexity of the project, you have integrations. One of the things I appreciate about working with your team is we were very diligent about our DevOps process. We knew what our code branches looked like. We knew how we were going to do merge requests and how we were going to coordinate even when we were touching the same features. So, and your QA team, like I saw, we had engaged a previous partner to help us with QA and do some test coverage stuff. The quality around how your team understood our business requirements and writing the tests and incorporating that into our DevOps process, so we had confidence about when we were pushing our releases. So, no, I have no cautionary tales, but because your team was there helping us figure out that deployment process, and it was coordinated, and like we weren't stepping on each other's toes, which is a danger when you're partnering on dev.
Okay. Yeah, no, thanks for that. Paul, anything from your side about that?
Yeah, I think from a cautionary tale, it would be more of it's a lesson learned. I think that we had unrealistic expectations that our very detailed requirements document was going to be the marching orders for the full project. And what we found as we engaged with your team is that we hadn't done a deep enough dive to explain it in developer terms. And one of the most valuable things we learned to appreciate over time were the backlog discussions. And just as a story for the audience, one of the most pivotal parts of the project, we were doing a rewrite of an existing system, so we knew how it worked, but we wanted it to be better. We wanted it to be modular so that it would have greater length of life. But we had written out in sentences and bullet points the main workflows. And a key task well into this project was to do a process map of all of the nuances in our royalty billing workflows. There's a lot of if-else options. What brand are you? When did you become a franchisee, et cetera? And I believe ultimately we went through 18 iterations, many of them in joint sessions with both the developers and the QA team, until we engineered out all of the questions. So, I think from a cautionary tale perspective, it would be, don't go into a project presuming that you've got it all nailed down. And you need to expect that whomever you're going to be working with is going to bring questions to you. And that's not a bad thing. Questions from your developer partner should be welcomed. And I would argue that if you give somebody your requirements for a rebuild, and there are no questions, they say, sure, we can do it in X months for Y dollars, that would be cause for concern. There should be questions, because how can they truly know your business processes, as well as you do?
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I think those questions, the right types of questions, is what you're talking about, and then also making sure that your requirements is really well done. And so that I must say, your requirements was really well done, and so it helped the process immensely. I think that's one thing. Now, apart from that, Trevor, maybe you have any other types of advice that you could give to someone who wants to embark on this, making this decision in the first place, or one of these two choices. What would you say to them?
I think one piece of advice is, especially for us that are in management, like listen to the folks on the ground, the folks operating the system. Listen to your devs. They have their hands on the code base. They know what they wish they could rewrite, what they're trying to navigate around, the things that may or may not work, and they may still be mysterious because someone else wrote them 10 years ago. They have a good sense of what it takes when they have to either change a system behavior or add something in or plug in a new integration.
And you need to have a development partner that will tell you that.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes you need the new eyes on the code as well, a fresh set. I mean, that's how we found some of the core architectural issues, a fresh set of eyes doing the horrible code tracing activities. That's a good indicator. Like if they're spending 50% of their time trying to figure out what the code's doing or trying to navigate around it, then you are well on your way to a rewrite candidate project. Because there's certain things where the cost to maintain and to enhance, it's prohibited. You're just never going to catch up.
In our discussion the other day, you mentioned something about instrumentation. Sorry.
Yeah.
You want to say something about that?
I would love to. Thanks for teeing that up. So one of the things that when we're talking about software, you kind of glossed over third parties. Software now is very, very modular. You're tying into an ecosystem. The system we have right now, I'm thinking in third-party apps, I got 3 different marketing MarTech solutions on top of, and not even mentioning all the fine tech stuff behind the scenes. So it really is your applications, this glue and collection and orchestrator across a lot of different services. And even some of those are microservices in your own architecture. So when software is getting that complex, I find it really helpful to have a good application performance monitoring tool that gives you visibility from the UX all the way down to the database transactions. It's one of those old scars that I carried from previous dev days where I'll be really quick with a story. I was a CIO at a maternity hospital, and we had this application monitoring tool installed, and we had an old .NET hospital information system that managed registration and billing. And every quarter, the thing would crash. I mean, it would just spin down. Because we had the monitoring software, we could figure out the trace event down to the database call that tanked the entire system. And it was because history from child number 1, and we were timing out. So things like that can give you insights into your architecture and where you have, it's fragile. And that's been helpful from a diagnostic tool, not just having the extra set of eyes, but when you get a complex code base, I mean, we're already at 500,000 lines a year into our system. You need to have something to help pinpoint where the issue is.
Okay. Yeah, and I suppose you're looking at something like New Relic.
Yeah. That's I'm a fan. I have good friends over there. They've treated us right.
All right, great. So maybe I'll come back to you, Paul. Maybe if you can just in short, I know you've already mentioned something about that, but how do you think Covalience was able to help you in the decision-making process as to how to approach your implementation, how to approach the rewriting of the various systems that we've been involved in?
Sure. I've got a couple of things. I think back to my previous statement, I think the backlog refinement meetings were critical because And we had more of them than we expected. But in hindsight, we've realized that those meetings helped to build the product that we brought to market, and with incredible stability from the start. And the other thing that's occurred to me as I was listening to you, Trevor, obviously you have to work with your technical resources, the people who are actually putting the code together, but understanding the front end user's experience, whether that's the client or in our case, we have multiple tiers of users. We've got corporate administrators, etc. If you look strictly at just the legacy application when you're considering a rebuild, you're going to miss the boat. One of the things we learned and were prompted to do by Covalience was to review how they're extending the system. And that's a nice way of saying where the old system, how broke is the old system from the perspective that they're doing workarounds. And in this case, there are numerous situations where the users of the legacy system were like, well, we know that that's there, but you can't click that button because it's not going to work. We have to go and do this external analysis in Excel, come up with the number, and then plug that in. Those conversations with the end users who weren't part of the core project team were critical to deliver something that was going to work for them when we looped them into the QA process. And the original intention was to keep our QA group, a smaller group, but that expanded to those end users. And ultimately, if the developed functionality matched the scope of work, that was fine, but it needed to work well for the end user. And it led to discussions about screen design and even color scheme that, I was like, really, does it matter? But in the end, it did. What information was presented above the fold and all of that stuff. Like, we got into some of that, and we're able to work with the Covalience team on the design UX, doing mock-ups first before any programming was done behind the scenes. Once that mock-up was ready, they would reference not only the requirements, but the aforementioned process maps and building the modules and plugging it together. This is becoming a bit long-winded, but I would echo Trevor's call out of the QA abilities of the Covalience team. I think largely in part due to the prep discussions before any coding was done. Whenever we were given something to QA, it was right most of the time, like 80% of the time. It worked the way it needed to, and we had a strong sense and came to know the QA team because as they were testing on the back end, if they got stuck, they would ask us questions. So from a QA burden on these big projects, most of it was on us because it would get coded, it would get QA'd, it would get released to us, and we couldn't move on to the next sprint until we did our own QA, and we often ran into capacity bottlenecks. And what I appreciated from the Covalience project manager was, there were a couple of times when we had a one-on-one conversation, and it was, it was a nice conversation, but it was like, look, the project deadline is going to slip if we don't get this QA. And the implication was that we're not going to move ahead and skip the QA. Like we'll stop and pause and take the time you need to catch up, but we're not going to go ahead and waste valuable resource hours coding something that may be wrong and have to be redone. It's never been stated by you, Stefan, but I think that there's some sort of internal rule at Covalience that the preference is to code it one time and not have to redo it on the project because that's bad for you and bad for the client.
Oh man, it is very important to our developers. We do sometimes have to recode things, and we do it gladly, but if we can avoid it, absolutely. And I'll give you a comment to the QA team. They will appreciate that. So thank you for that.
I think it starts with the requirements. Like, I remember our first project together, Stefan. I handed a bunch of back-end user administration screens. I had them mocked out. Like, Paul, you think like, hey, I'm pretty good, right? Here's the UX. It's just an admin screen. Like, we're assigning people to groups. How hard is this? The amount of questions I got back in requirements refinement was phenomenal, to the point where when we get into QA, the scripts that your QA analysts write, I could hand to any one of our end users to help me do the QA. That's how tight they are.
Yeah, and we all recall fondly this process on these projects, but at the time, sometimes there was grumbling because we would have a backlog refinement or a QA session, and we wouldn't get through anything, and we would schedule another one. So, my final comment on how did Covalience help? It was a willingness and an insistence to communicate about the project and the priorities at hand, the current sprint, the upcoming sprint, as much as needed. And that sometimes became a problem from a capacity issue, but it really helped us understand how to do big projects moving forward. You can have the greatest requirements in the world, but anything that's complicated and is going to require a lot of lines of codes and integrations and things like that, it's going to take time, and it's worth front loading the difficult conversaons. I
absolutely
recommend that enough. And
don't do the easy thing first. Yeah.
Most of my experience comes from like the project manager, staff management perspective, and getting everybody to get on board with that and be realistic about the project timelines is important.
Yeah.
So.
Okay, great. Yeah, thank you for that. I don't know how much time we have. Maybe we have time for one more question here. So let me just see, what is it that we want to ask? So I mentioned in my when we spoke about it in my presentation that if you refactor it will actually increase the lifetime of your product. So do you agree with that? Have you observed that, Trevor?
Yeah, I mean, we've been in positions where to procure a new system, even if it's a commercial off-the-shelf system that needs configuration, like that takes time. And we've been in several positions where we've had to extend the life, and that refactoring, the business rule changes when at the hospital in the Middle East, like the regulatory environment was changing every 6 months. We didn't have any choice other than to refactor on a continual basis.
Yeah.
So I think like software is like kids. I mean, you got to take care of them. You got to feed them. You got to make sure that they're clothed. I mean, like all of these things. I mean, we don't treat infrastructure like that anymore, but the software you can't just install it and forget about it.
Yeah. And the other thing is, I think your developers even forget what they've done in certain places. Now, obviously, if you've got your documentation, they can pick it up pretty quickly. But if you just leave it alone and you bring even that same team back after a while, then you'll see they're slower, because they're going to have to study again what happened here, and it takes time. Apart from that, just I think the things tend to fall apart a little bit. But Paul, I was wondering this regulatory or legal requirements, if that also had an influence on your business, as to have to rewrite certain things. Or
more from a business rules perspective, but you mentioned in your slide deck, there was a bullet point about being cognizant of privacy laws and security, and that's only getting more complicated and serious over the years. And it's gotten to the point now where, every project that we do, whether it's custom software development or custom configuration of an off-the-shelf platform, there is a technology, security, and a legal and compliance component to everything. And there was some internal discussion and debate. It's like, well, why does every project have to go through some sort of security discussion? It's because it's that important. We're dealing with data, and I think it's become part of our strategic planning analysis, and we're getting better at planning the projects properly, being realistic about the timelines. And as far as like the whole refactor versus rebuild, most of my experience to date has been in working with the team on legacy or inherited systems or applications, and a rebuild was presumed from the start. However, in the lead up to this webinar, it's triggered a lot of conversations and thinking on our side about when you do rebuild, you should rebuild with refactoring in mind. And I think working with a partner and using a modular approach to the underlying technologies and even how you design the workflow components, even if that's going to take you more time in your rebuild life cycle to get to your MVP, it's worth it so that once you go live, you can already start planning for your refactor cycles, checking in on things and all of that. And if it's been built from a flexible perspective, you'll have an easier time refactoring in the future, particularly if the developers change or the subject matter experts on the operational side change as well. Because
one of the things I really appreciated that you said about yesterday, Paul, was how you built in business process configuration as part of your architectural solution. So, I mean, usually like we do our process flows and we set up our applications, even if modular ones, but to be able for you guys to configure those business rule changes in system without necessarily having to recode anything, I think it's a case for rebuilding and minimizing the amount of refactoring you have to do.
Yeah. And just to follow up on that, when it comes to our billing rules, in the old system, every time we had a new wrinkle introduced, we had to go back to the tech folks to go in and effectively code that solution in and work it in. In the newer systems we've designed, in the admin screens, you just go to business rules, new business rule, and there are in some cases very complicated options to set this up. But we know enough about the general landscape of our business to set most of the things out there that could be configured, and it's allowed us to add new features over the last few years without going back to code.
I know our developers loved working in your system because of that. It is the system being dynamic that way, and that you can configure it for any number of situations. So anyway, I think that's the end of our time now. I'm going to hand this back to Tracy for question and answers, I think.
Yes, thank you so much, Stefan. So we will now be taking questions from the audience. So if you haven't had a chance yet to submit your question, now is the time to do so. And we'll go ahead and start with the first one here from Kevin. So he asks, how important do you feel the return on investment and ultimately the total cost of ownership are in the final decision to refactor and rewrite? And is there maybe a third option to replace? So I'll just kind of open that up. Whoever would like to start, you can go ahead and answer.
I mean, I can take a stab at that. I would say, of course, it's important. And, in most of our recent cases, we needed to build the new system regardless. But understanding and tracking that return on investment is more important. And we're realizing that more now, years later, as we've been able to maintain with very limited refactoring and modifying that original cost assessment is looking better and better as the years go along. However, lessons learned and where I personally want to do better is understanding that the cost to bring a new product to market need to include the client team's time that is involved, because that's really part of it, and that should be part of any proposal that's put together for your company's leadership to consider. So I kind of skipped around the answer, but ROI is definitely important and needs to be promoted more often in any big proposal, any software development. That's if you're working on a project that's going to be 6 to 18 months, you should have a really good understanding of the ROI that can be explained to the leadership team and backed up if at some point you're questioned. particularly not if, but when you hit change management. Like, oh, we thought this part was going to be easier and it's not. There was a change we didn't anticipate that's going to impact the timeline and the cost. Don't be shy about talking about that and update your projections. But closing thought on this would be, build your application with refactoring ease in mind, if you can.
Yeah, and so Kevin's question included that total cost of ownership, which, as you said, basically, if you don't have a lot of development that have to be done after your system is live already, then I think that diminishes that cost of ownership, because it minimizes your maintenance later on. Although you still have to do your refactoring, upgrading your modules, your tech stack, and stuff like that. So that there is still a cost. You can't say it's free now. Yeah. And obviously your hosting and yeah.
For us, it's important, especially looking at TCO, and we consider all three options: refactoring, rebuilding, or buying in our analysis.
Yeah.
I think what for us is the primary driver is the features we're looking and the speed at which we need to get them, because that tends to drive both the top line and the bottom line of that equation. And when we saw in the most recent decision to engage in a build, it was primarily because we had tried to work with our previous software partner on enhancements, and we just could not get them to our donor base quick enough. So it was actually more of the consumer market driven decision. Yeah. Not that we're not looking at the financials at the end, but it's both top line and bottom line.
Yeah, I mean, if you lose a customer, the cost of that is, what is the cost of that? That's a much bigger cost than the software maybe. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, no, that's great. Well, thank you so much. I think, unfortunately, that is all the time we have today for questions. I know we were only able to get to one, but I think the panel discussion was very fruitful today, and I'm hoping that it was very valuable to all of you who are joining us online. So yes, thank you, Paul, Trevor, and Stefan, for your time and sharing your expertise with us today. We really appreciate it. And for all of those who are online, if you have additional questions or you would like to learn more about Covalience, you can see our contact information on the screen shortly. And tomorrow we'll be sending out a copy of today's webinar recording. So if you would like to listen back to it or share it with a colleague, you can do that. And in an effort to continue bringing you valuable content, we would appreciate your feedback on this webinar and on future topics that you would find valuable. So you should see a feedback survey pop up on your screen if you're in the webinar room, or you will see a link in the chat if you're joining us on LinkedIn. And if you could take a minute to fill that out, we would really appreciate it. And so again, a big thank you, Stefan, Paul, and Trevor, for your time today. Really enjoyed the discussion and the presentation. I think it was very valuable time. So thank you again for joining us today. We hope that you enjoyed our webinar, and we look forward to seeing you next time.